SANDHAN, All Gujarat Integrated Classroom.
સેટેલાઇટના માધ્યમથી જોડતી કડી એટલે સંધાન.
Today, myself, Dr. Rakesh Patel, from Microbiology Department, R.G. Shah Science College, I'm here to discuss about AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. Basically, this particular topic of AIDS has been selected in a sense that it is a extremely important topic which concerns not only in India but throughout the world. It is on a epidemic scale, and every year millions of people die because of AIDS. This particular disease, no doubt it is a part of a syllabus in many of the institutes, but for a layman also it is very important to understand what is AIDS, how it spreads, and how it can be controlled. So today we will begin the discussion on AIDS with few abbreviations. What is AIDS? AIDS. A stands for acquired, I for immuno, D for deficiency, and S for syndrome. Acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. Now, each of these particular words has certain meaning, and what is that we will discuss later on. But AIDS means acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. Similar to AIDS, there is another word which we know it as a HIV. HIV stands for human immunodeficiency virus. It is this particular virus which is responsible for AIDS. So HIV is a virus and AIDS is a condition. This particular slide shows you the difference between the two. AIDS basically is not a disease, it is a stage. Why it is called as a stage? Because when HIV virus enters the host, specifically human beings, then as we will see later that it leads to immunodeficiency in a host. So a stage is created or stage is achieved in a host, and that stage is known as a immunodeficiency stage. So it is an acquired immunodeficiency, and because of this particular stage, the host starts suffering from various secondary infections, various diseases. There are many diseases which the host will suffer because of his immunodeficiency status, because his immunity is lowered, because he is now not able to withstand the foreign organisms or pathogens. He will be suffering from various diseases which under normal circumstances he is prone to immune from them. So this is basically the difference between AIDS. One has to be very clear that AIDS is a stage and it is not a disease. But in a routine, when we talk about, in general, most of the people consider AIDS as a disease. Now let us first of all view the global situation. Let us understand the magnitude of this particular disease. Now, according to the World AIDS Day, which was celebrated on December 1st, 2012, the United Nations AIDS data, they say that though the first case was reported in 1981, even after 30 years, there are more than 35 million people living with AIDS. We in short call it as a PLHIV, people living with HIV, those who have got HIV infections in their body. There are 35 million people. Every year, that is in the last year, the newly infected worldwide cases were 2.5 million. That comes to around 7,000 cases per day. And the death due to AIDS related causes, it was 1.7 million. I am insisting again that since AIDS is a condition where the immune response is lowered, as a result, host will suffer from many diseases, and that is why the deaths are normally due to the secondary infections or other infections. So we call collectively these deaths as a AIDS related infections or due to the AIDS disease. Now, if we consider this as a public health issue, then in the past 30 years, totally 25 million people have died. And at present, where 35 million people are living with HIV, around 97% of these people, they are in low and middle income countries, that is in a developing and developed or what we call it as a poor countries, underdeveloped countries. These cases are very high in sub-Saharan African countries. And the irony is, most people living with HIV or at a risk of HIV, they do not have access to prevention, care and treatment, and still there is no cure. That is, even after 30 years of this epidemic, scientists have not been able to come across the specific cure for this particular disease. This slide indicates the HIV prevalence rate map. As you can see that sub-Saharan African countries in in South Africa, you can see the dark red and brown patches where the AIDS related cases are very high. HIV infections is highly prevalent. Now, if we consider HIV and youth, then the most important point which draws our attention is that HIV primarily affects those persons who are in their most productive years, that is in an age group between 14 to 24. That is, in other words, you can say more than 40% of the new infections are among these particular age groups. If we consider HIV and relate it with women, then about half of all the people living with HIV, more than half, that is 58%, which are there in sub-Saharan African, are women. Why it is more prevalent among women? It is because the HIV is due to the sexual violence, gender inequality, differential access to service, and women's vulnerability to HIV, specifically younger women which are more biologically prone to HIV. If we relate HIV with a treatment, then the last statistical data indicates that in 2011, more than 8 million people living with HIV had an access to antiretroviral therapy. Antiretroviral therapy basically is for HIV because this particular virus belongs to retrovirus family. This HIV infections, no doubt, have start declining by more than 25% since 2001. That is, in the last one decade, the HIV infections have declined by 20%. And around 16.8 billion rupees, $16.8 billion US dollars were available from all sources for the HIV response in 2011. Now let us go to what is HIV. Now, since we have already discussed the difference between HIV and AIDS. AIDS is a status of an individual. It is a immunodeficiency status, and HIV is a virus. The full name is human immunodeficiency virus. This particular virus is a retrovirus and it attacks the WBCs, specifically helper T cells, that is CD4 cells in the host. These CD4 cells play a very important role in a defense mechanism of an individual. Therefore, when this HIV virus attacks helper T cells and destroys them, one of the important defense system of the body is weakened. The count of CD4 cells decreases very significantly. As a result, the host is prone to various kinds of infections. Now, this HIV virus is a threatening global epidemic. This is preventable, manageable, but most important is it is not curable. HIV virus was known formerly by different names. For example, it was known as HTLV3, that is human T cell lymphotropic viruses. It was also known as a lymphadenopathy associated virus, LAV, and AIDS associated retrovirus, ARV. These were some of the names by which HIV virus was earlier known as. Again, coming back to the same thing, what is AIDS? It is acquired immunodeficiency syndrome and it is caused by HIV, and it limits the body's ability to fight infections due to reduction in helper T cells, that is CD4 cells. Hence, the people or the hosts have very weak immune system, defense mechanism is reduced to zero, and thus people are predisposed to multiple opportunistic infections leading to death. We call it as a opportunistic infections because under normal circumstances, the host would not have contracted such kind of infections if his immune system was well. If his immune system hadn't weakened up, then such opportunistic infections would not have been contracted by that particular host. Now, as I have told you, AIDS is a condition. Then, how do we define this particular condition? That is, how do we recognize that a particular person is in that particular condition, that is, he has a AIDS? Then we have two parameters to deal with. First one, persons with positive HIV serology who have ever had a CD4 lymphocyte count below 200 cells per microliters. If the count had ever reduced below 200 cells, count of what? Count of CD4 cells, helper T cells, then, or the CD4 lymphocyte percentage, if you consider it as a percentile value, then it has reduced below 14%. Then under these conditions, either less than CD4 count less than 200 or below 14%, you can say, then that person is considered to have a condition which we call it as a AIDS. Now, when was this particular disease was discovered? AIDS was first clinically observed in 1981 in United States, and later on in the same year many new cases were also observed. Such cases were mainly prevalent in drug users, in gay communities, and these people were suffering from no known cause of impaired immunity and showed the symptoms of pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, PCP. This is basically a rare opportunistic infection which would only be found in immune compromised individuals. So the point is that when it was discovered that certain group of people, specifically drug users and gay communities, then it was observed that their immune system was highly compromised. As a result, certain secondary infections commonly occurred in them. In those early days, this particular disease was termed as GRID,